Grace. Miller had never once considered herself the kind of girl anyone would call popular. And that was, precisely why the sudden crowd around her at Millfield University's Spring Festival photo booth felt so surreal. She was a quiet sophomore studying botany, the kind of student who spent more Friday nights in the greenhouse cataloging orchid specimens than at parties, and yet here she was, laughing in the golden afternoon, light while half the junior class seemed to be, lining up to take photos with her. It had started absurdly enough because of a squirrel. 2 weeks earlier, during a rare moment of campus chaos, a squirrel had darted into the student union with a stolen bagel clutched triumphantly in its paws, and Grace, without thinking, had chased it down 3 flights of stairs, out the emergency exit and across the quad, phone camera rolling the entire time out of pure reflexive habit. The video, Grace sprinting after a bagel thief, squirrel while shrieking with laughter, her wild curly auburn hair flying loose from its bun, had gone unexpectedly, ridiculously viral on the campus social media page. Within days, Bagel Squirrel Girl had become a minor campus celebrity, the kind of good-natured, internet fame that made strangers smile and wave at her in the dining hall, which was how, on the sunny afternoon of the spring festival, Grace found herself the unlikely center of a small photo booth crowd, students she'd never spoken to before requesting selfies, laughing about the squirrel video, treating her with the easy warmth reserved for someone briefly, harmlessly famous. Ethan Hayes watched the entire spectacle from a safe distance, near the lemonade stand, arms crossed, jaw tight in a way he was fully aware looked ridiculous, given that he had absolutely no claim to feeling this way. Ethan was, by any objective campus measurement, the closest thing Millfield University had to actual royalty. Star quarterback, Dean's List every semester despite a workload that would have broken lesser students, the kind of effortlessly handsome that made freshman girls forget how to form sentences in his presence. He had every reason to be standing somewhere more interesting than the edge of a photo booth line, watching a girl he'd been quietly, hopelessly in love with for the better part of 8 months take photo with everyone except him. He and Grace weren't strangers, not exactly. They'd been paired together the previous semester for an environmental science lab neither of them had particularly wanted to take, Ethan fulfilling a science credit requirement, Grace needing the course for her botany major. What should have been an unremarkable 10 weeks of soil samples and pH testing had turned, gradually and against every expectation Ethan had walked in with, into the best part of his week. Grace was funny in a dry, understated way that caught him off guard every single time, endlessly patient explaining plant biology concepts he genuinely struggled with, entirely unimpressed by his football star reputation in a way that Ethan found, embarrassingly, more attractive than any amount of admiration ever had. By the end of the semester, Ethan had fallen for her completely, and had done absolutely nothing about it, paralyzed by a fear that felt entirely unfamiliar to a guy who threw 50-yard passes under fourth quarter. Pressure without blinking. Grace Miller made him nervous in a way 3 years of varsity football never had. He told himself repeatedly that he'd say something eventually, some perfect moment that never quite arrived. And now here he was, watching a line of strangers casually request photos with her while he stood 20 feet away, too much of a coward to simply walk over and ask for one himself. "You're doing the jaw thing again," said Marcus, Ethan's roommate and the only person on campus who'd correctly diagnosed his feelings. For Grace months before, Ethan had admitted them out loud. Marcus had wandered over with 2 lemonades, handing one to Ethan without being asked. The jealous jaw thing. "It's not subtle, man." "I'm not jealous," Ethan said, in the exact tone of someone who was, in fact, extremely jealous. "Sure," Marcus said, unbothered. "That's why you've been standing here for 15 minutes watching Grace Miller take selfies with the entire junior class instead of just walking over there like a normal person." Ethan didn't answer, mostly because Marcus was infuriatingly correct. He watched Grace laugh at something a guy from the lacrosse team said. Watched her lean into the frame for another photo. Watched the easy way she seemed to belong in that crowd of people who barely knew her, and something twisted in his chest that felt embarrassingly close to panic. He had exactly 1 more semester left at Millfield before graduation scattered them all across the country into separate lives. And he was standing here frozen, watching the girl he loved get photographed by everyone except him. It was Marcus in the end who gave him the push he needed, not with words but with a firm shove between the shoulder blades that sent Ethan stumbling 2 full steps toward the photo booth before he could stop himself. "Go," Marcus said simply, "before someone else in that line beats you to it." Ethan straightened his jacket, took a breath that did absolutely nothing to steady his suddenly racing heart, and walked directly into the middle of the photo booth crowd, right as the photographer was arranging Grace for her next shot with a group of sorority sisters. "Room for one more?" Ethan asked, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, though his palms were embarrassingly damp. The crowd went predictably, a little electric at the sight of the school's star quarterback suddenly inserting himself into their photo session. Grace turned, surprised, her curly auburn hair catching the late afternoon light, and for a moment her expression flickered through genuine confusion before settling into something warmer, something that made Ethan's stomach do an entirely undignified flip. "Ethan," she said, clearly caught off guard. "I didn't know you were even at the festival." "I wasn't invited to the photo," Ethan admitted, aware of every single person around them listening, and deciding in a rare moment of reckless honesty that he didn't particularly care. "So I figured I'd just show up anyway." There was a beat of surprised laughter from the small crowd, and Grace's cheeks colored slightly, though she was smiling now. The same understated dry smile that had wrecked Ethan completely back in environmental science lab. "That's a very confident way of crashing a photo, Hayes." "I've been told confidence is my whole personality," Ethan said, which earned him another laugh from the crowd, though his eyes stayed fixed entirely on Grace. The photographer, sensing an opportunity, ushered them together for the shot, and Ethan found himself standing beside Grace Miller in front of a small crowd of curious onlookers, close enough to catch the faint scent of her shampoo, close enough that his heart was hammering in a way that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with 8 months of carefully buried feelings, suddenly threatening to surface in front of half the junior class. The photo was taken. The crowd began to disperse, drawn toward the festival's live band setting up nearby, and within a few minutes it was just the 2 of them standing near the now empty photo booth. Late afternoon sunlight slanting gold across the quad. "Can I be honest with you about something?" Ethan asked, and something in his voice made Grace go still, studying him with the same careful attention she used to give soil samples back in lab. "Depends what it is," she said, though her tone was gentle, curious rather than guarded. "I've been standing over by the lemonade stand for the better part of 20 minutes, Ethan admitted, "watching you take photos with basically everyone except me, and I was so jealous I could barely think straight, which is a genuinely embarrassing thing for me to admit because I have never once in my entire life been jealous of a photo booth line before today." Grace's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering across her face. "Ethan Hayes jealous? That's a new one." "I know," he said, laughing a little at his own expense. "I've spent the last 8 months telling myself there'd be a perfect moment to say this, and there never was one, so I'm just going to say it now, badly, in the middle of a festival, because apparently watching you smile at the entire lacrosse team was the push I needed." He took a breath. "I like you, Grace. I have for months since lab. Probably since the day you correctly called out my terrible soil pH calculations in front of the whole class and didn't even flinch when I tried to argue with you about it." Grace stared at him for a long moment, something complicated moving across her face. Surprise, certainly, but underneath it something softer, something that looked almost like relief. "You realize," she said finally, voice quieter now, "that I spent that entire semester convinced you thought I was just the annoying lab partner who corrected your math. I thought you were the smartest, funniest person I'd met at this entire university," Ethan said honestly. "I just had absolutely no idea how to say that without sounding like an idiot. So I said nothing instead. For 8 months, like a coward." "You're not a coward," Grace said. "You literally just walked into a photo booth crowd and announced your feelings to a dozen strangers. That's the opposite of cowardly. Only because my roommate physically pushed me," Ethan admitted. And Grace laughed, a genuine warm laugh that eased something tight in his chest. They talked for another hour as the festival wound down around them, sitting on the low stone wall near the quad's fountain, and Grace admitted somewhat shyly that she'd noticed Ethan watching her from the lemonade stand before he ever worked up the nerve to walk over, that some hopeful nervous part of her had wondered if he'd come find her before. The crowd swallowed her up entirely. What followed wasn't some instant, tidy fairy tale, and both of them were glad of it, because it felt truer that way. They started slow, careful, both of them still finishing out demanding final semesters, Ethan navigating the pressure of his last football season and scholarship, recruiters watching his every move, Grace splitting her time between coursework and long hours in the greenhouse finishing her senior thesis on native pollinator plants. There were awkward moments, misread signals. One particularly tense week in April, when Ethan's job interview travel schedule made Grace quietly wonder if this was building toward something real, or simply a lovely, temporary distraction before graduation scattered them in separate directions. But Ethan showed up consistently, in the unglamorous, ordinary ways that mattered more than any single grand gesture. Driving 2 hours to watch her present her thesis defense, learning the names of every plant species in her greenhouse research, just so he could ask genuinely informed questions about her work. Sitting quietly in the stands during her botany club's spring plant sale fundraiser, even though it was, by his own cheerful admission, the least athletically interesting event he'd ever attended. By graduation, 8 weeks after that photo booth confession, they had built something steady and real, tested by the ordinary pressures of senior year rather than manufactured drama, which made it feel, to both of them, considerably more durable than the version of love built purely on grand romantic gestures. Ethan received an offer to play for a regional professional team 2 states away. Grace was accepted into a graduate botany program with a research focus in ecological restoration at a university close enough to Ethan's new city that neither of them had to face the heartbreak of an ending they weren't ready for. On the day of their graduation ceremony, Grace's family took the traditional photos beneath the university's ivy-covered clock tower, the same ceremonial spot every graduating class used for decades of keepsake pictures. Ethan, freshly capped and gowned, wandered over uninvited, exactly the way he had at the festival months earlier, standing at the edge of Grace's family photo with an expectant, hopeful grin. "Room for one more?" he asked, echoing his own words from that spring afternoon, and Grace's father, who had heard the entire photo booth story in exhaustive detail from his daughter over the past several months, laughed and waved him warmly into the frame without hesitation. Grace looked at Ethan settling in beside her, cap slightly crooked, grinning like a man who'd spent 8 months too terrified to say the truth out loud, and had finally, permanently, stopped being afraid of it. "You really do have a habit of showing up uninvited to photos," she murmured, leaning into his shoulder as the photographer counted down. "Best decision I ever made," Ethan said, and meant it completely. As the camera flashed and captured them together, exactly where, it turned out, he'd belonged all along.